I want to take you on a little trip back with me nearly 40 years ago to a place called 1987. This was a year when Cheers was broadcasting on nearly every television set across the country, a year where Capri Suns were the trending drink in children's lunchboxes, and most importantly, this was the year that one of the most influential video games to ever release was debuted. Final Fantasy I on the Nintendo Entertainment System. There are very few franchises in the gaming industry that have the staying power to carry over from generation to generation, but Final Fantasy not only has stuck around, but has also helped to define the gaming space in ways that most of us have never imagined, and I would expect are often taken for granted. What's even more wild to consider is that gaming wasn't nearly as popular as it is today, and most pop culture wasn't steeped in fantastical storytelling, which makes the staying power of Final Fantasy into the mainstream market all the more impressive. Now here we are 36 years later, and we have our hands on the next iteration of this franchise, Final Fantasy XVI. This new feather in Square Enix's cap has aimed to bring about amazing storytelling, beautiful art design, and an updated combat system that redefines the franchise for a more modern audience. And while this new flavor of game design has some amazing moments that are over the top and fantastic, there are just as many, if not more, aspects of this game that are just downright terrible. I want to preface that this is the first Final Fantasy game I have played all the way through, and I believe that my perspective on this game is not one of how it sits inside the Final Fantasy franchise as a whole, but as a video game to be enjoyed by a prospective fan. I wanted to become a Final Fantasy fan and enjoy the franchise just like many of you do and have over the courses of your lifetimes. And while I will be keeping my eye on titles and expansions in the future, for now, I will likely be putting my investment into this series on hold. I seriously don't think that Final Fantasy XVI is a bad game, at least not in the sense that the developers didn't know what they were doing. They had a vision, and I believe they executed their ideas almost perfectly from their perspective. I just think the vision for this game itself is very flawed, and this makes 16 kind of impossible to review. On one hand, there is a video game full of narrative bloat, quest mediocrity, and half-baked RPG systems, but on the other hand, if you stripped all of that out and only focused on the core campaign missions and the combat, there would be a fantastic game underneath it all. But if you only had that aspect of the game, it would still be flawed, as the core combat, main campaign, and open world are extremely simple and quite restrictive. Final Fantasy XVI has been one of the few games on a short list that I was certain was going to be my game of the year for 2023. This was mostly due to the fact that the renovations to the combat system and semi-open world design were 100% up my alley. In my head, I was picturing something like God of War Ragnarok or Jedi Survivor, but with the depth of the Final Fantasy narratives and RPG systems. And spoiler warning, that is not what we got. About a week or so before the full launch, Square put out a demo of 16 for fans to get a taste of what was right around the corner. I too was excited, so I downloaded the game and I played through it. And unfortunately, I was very disappointed in what I was playing. The world felt lifeless and empty, the combat was spammy and boring, but most importantly, the presentation of the story was driving me insane. Every couple of steps Clive took was interrupted by a cutscene, and it was so immersion breaking. But I thought to myself, you know, this is just the demo and the intro. I bet you there is a lot more content to explore in the full game, and there are probably just a bunch of cutscenes and narrative buildup for the first few hours or so. And oh man, I couldn't have been more wrong if I had tried. I had heard this game had 11 plus hours of cutscenes in it, and while I was a bit concerned about that, I had assumed that the main campaign and side content would be so beefy and deep that it would allow for such storytelling. But that really isn't accurate. I think the best way to describe Final Fantasy XVI is that it's over-engineered. The game is constantly trying to impress you with flashy animations, title cards, cutscenes, and particle effects that eventually it just all begins to lose its luster. The gameplay loop is so cluttered that you don't actually get to experience the game itself very often. There are moments for sure, and when you do experience those moments, they are so amazing. And I had a fantastic time inside of those particular segments of the game. But not only are those moments few and far between, it takes about 10 plus hours of nonsense to get to a point where you're actually experiencing what could be even conceived as a video game. Square Enix wanted everything in 16 to be top-notch and beautiful, and they succeeded in that for sure. But by making everything excellent, it removes the weight from the more important aspects of the game, as all support from smaller mechanics are now weighted equally to the most important ones. Imagine if an architect went out and built a gorgeous building, but used materials made of gold and had diamond staircases and windows that would glow RGB on the pane. You see, everything would be in excess, causing clashes which would detract from the beauty of the building itself. Well, Final Fantasy XVI is that building. Every piece of dialogue is overwritten and has their own unique cutscenes. The menus are unintuitively overdesigned. Title cards are popping in and out constantly and interrupting gameplay. And even some of the gameplay mechanics themselves are overdesigned, like opening doors, which makes you press X to interact with the handle, and then you have to press R2 to open the door. And since the developers have spent so much time on things that actually don't matter, when it comes down to the things that are important, it's all very shallow, as the actual amount of real gameplay and story could probably be told in under 10 hours. I think what makes the lack of actual content even more frustrating is the fact that you are constantly interrupted by frivolous window dressing. There are many instances where Clive is in the middle of a cutscene, then it goes back to gameplay, which will tell you to go to a mission where you now have to pause to the menu and wait for more animations just to select a map marker. Then you select the map marker, load into a new area, then a chapter card pops up on your screen, then you walk a few steps, enter another cutscene, finish the cutscene, walk a few more steps to open a door, which then leads to, you guessed it, another cutscene. And I'm not exaggerating, this happens so frequently, and the whole time I was playing, I wasn't mad or anything, I just kept asking myself, why did they do this? The only reason I could think of having so many stopgaps in between gameplay would be if the players wanted to break from the main campaign to complete side quests or to explore the world. But since there is no world to explore and the side quests are filler at best, there is genuinely no reason for this design other than to break immersion, which I was constantly pulled out of. As soon as I would enter a great bit of the game with tons of action and boss encounters, I would immediately be pulled out of it with 4 or 5 cutscenes that could simply have been executed with character dialogue while traveling through the realms, or simply by having the cutscene continue without interruption. The pacing of Final Fantasy XVI is some of the poorest I have ever experienced in a video game. And it's a shame that something this spectacular that contains some of the most prolific and iconic boss fights ever seen in the gaming industry can be housed in such a gaudy and unforgivably boring narrative structure. It's my belief that Final Fantasy XVI struggles to assume an identity in the sense that it wanted to be either a season of Game of Thrones or one of the best action RPGs of all time. And instead of ironing out the process to change the gaming landscape forever, the devs chose a watered-down version of both of these ideas, which saddens me deeply at the prospect of what could have been, and is why I personally wouldn't recommend 16 to most people. One of the first things you'll notice when playing Final Fantasy XVI is that it is unapologetically complex. From its art design to its narrative, there is a rich and beautiful world at play here, and it's being torn apart through tales of politics, religion, exploration, sexuality, world dominance, and magic. And while there is no way possible to encapsulate everything about the story without making this video 10 hours long, I will do what any person in times like these would do: read the Final Fantasy wiki. The land of Valisthea is studded with mother crystals, glittering mountains of crystal that tower over the realms around them, blessing them with ether. For generations, people have flocked to these beacons to take advantage of their blessing, using the ether to conjure magics that lets them live the lives of comfort and plenty. Great powers have grown up around each mother crystal, and an uneasy peace has long reigned between them. Yet now the peace falters as the spread of the blight threatens to destroy their dominions. That's actually a pretty good description. Good job, Wiki. However, there is a little bit missing here that I think needs to be added. While it is true that the mother crystals have enhanced everyone's lives, they are actually now becoming depleted and are destroying the land around it, causing humanity to struggle, which is what they are calling the blight. Now it's up to us to destroy each mother crystal to prevent the blight from spreading further. But what makes things even more complicated is that the kingdoms and royal bloodlines have built their societies surrounding this magic ether, and even the common people have grown accustomed to this magic lifestyle as well. Destroying the crystals will not only help to just end the blight, but will sow chaos amongst the realms and undo the peace that has been established for generations. To be completely honest with you, the story is even much deeper than that and is interwoven quite well across all of the realms. Square Enix has created quite a narrative here that is incredibly detailed and lifelike. You almost feel that Valisthea is a real place and that we're watching a historic event unfold in real time. And while there is a lot going on with this game's main narrative, the real focus is of course with Clive Rossfield and his struggle in becoming the man and leader he is supposed to be. Clive is a really good character, and something I really enjoy about him, and all the characters I enjoy this about, is how they are all strong moral figures who care deeply about one another. While Final Fantasy is a franchise known for going over the top with their stories and world building, they also create hyper-exaggerated versions of how people act emotionally towards one another. And I really enjoyed how Clive, Jill, Cid, and many more people in this crew carried themselves. There was an evil permeating through their universe, and they always loved one another properly and selflessly, and they weren't afraid to show their emotions. It was really nice, actually, and I'm gonna try to be a better person because of it. And you can call me cringe in the comments if you want. I'm probably just getting soft in my old age. Speaking of side characters, I think Square did a great job of writing, voicing, and executing the vision of each character. Jill was very well portrayed, but I think my favorite had to be Lord Byron. He was so funny and charismatic, but he would also do anything to help support his family. Yeah, you see, I'm getting emotional again. I'm doing it again. The constant weaving in and out of various characters through this main quest was truly wonderful, and it actually made me feel like I was on a real quest with a merry band of heroes to prevent the blight from spreading. However, the execution and portrayal of the main narrative through the never-ending slog of cutscenes and constant interruptions really made it hard to enjoy all of this world building that Square was doing. The combat, boss battles, and art design were doing so much heavy lifting here, and if it weren't for those three things being so superb, I don't know if I would have been able to finish this game's main campaign, because the way this story was presented was absolutely deadening, as I have never been so thoroughly bored in my entire life. The way that Square Enix has designed their quests seems to be split into two categories. There are the main plot points where we are traveling to destroy the Mother Crystals, which these are mostly good. Then there are these smaller missions which are also part of the main campaign, but these are much more simple, and I would call them just fetch quests, and they're generally no more important than your average side content. I think the goal with these was to create peaks and valleys through the campaign, so that after you experience some of the amazing boss battles, you will have a moment to relax and absorb what you just experienced. And I don't entirely think that this is a bad call to make, but the valleys that Square created were extremely flat and dull. There is a section of the game where you complete a tremendous boss fight and experience one of the best and most powerful cutscenes in the game. And as it concludes, you head back to the hideaway as your partner was injured during the fight and needs to rest in the infirmary. So the game decides that we actually need to wait for our fictional character to heal and sends Clive to clear villages of Akashic enemies in another mission. Now, this might sound exciting, but I assure you it's just glorified side content. The NPCs we deal with were not major characters, and the areas that we head to are not super important. It's just side quests injected into the main storyline for God knows what reason. 16 does this quite frequently. You will complete a badass mission that was so beautiful from start to finish, and then you're just thrusted into menial side content that has no real effect on the game whatsoever, sucking the soul out of everything you just achieved previously. If Square Enix could have just put the focus of the main campaign surrounding these high-octane Mother Crystal missions and boss fights, this game would have been my game of the year 100%. Now, I'm not saying we can't have moments of downtime or missions that hold less importance. It's the implementation of said content that I have a problem with, rather than placing blame on the content itself. I would like to use God of War Ragnarok as an example to make a comparison of what I believe is a good way to execute cinematic mechanics mixed with gameplay design, as I do think there are some parallels here when it comes to the narrative structure. Inside of God of War, the story was always moving forward. There were some slow moments, of course, but they were deliberately slow to evoke a certain emotional tone. However, if there was an urgent moment told via a cutscene, the story would explain what is needed to explain, let the player then take action and control, and any extra context that was needed would be explained by our characters resuming their dialogue between one another on their travels. And when I interviewed Danielle Basutti, who plays Freya inside of God of War, we even talked about how the directors deliberately wanted characters to be moving and talking so that the story never had moments of excessive downtime.
I was slightly lamenting some of those moments, only because, there I am talking about my childhood or something really something very emotional that happened with my brother when we were kids, and we're just, I'm the Falcon and we're just hanging out, and I'm like, wait, I don't know what's going on. I'm so used to these moments being grounded in the cinematics. And they said, it's just, there's so much territory to cover in the game that some of these pieces of the narrative need to just be as you're walking through, like trudging through the 9 realms. But don't worry, they said, this information will not be lost on the gamer, because that was my number one concern. I said, how could they really feel the impact of things? I mean, even Kratos talking about Calliope and me talking about Baldur and all these things that felt like, no, we need to be around a campfire. And they're like, you don't, you'll be okay.
Unfortunately, Final Fantasy XVI doesn't do any of that. And I suppose you could argue it's an artistic choice, but I don't think it is. There is no need for every single piece of dialogue to have its time in the spotlight. Not to mention, these cutscenes aren't even enjoyable to watch, as most of the time our characters are simply standing in place, crossing their arms. Framing every moment in a story as it all being equally weighted removes any emotional toll that was taken during something like a death scene, and going to a village to a random NPC should not be even as close to as important and doesn't deserve a full interruption of the experience. I am fine with narratives, I am fine with cutscenes, but what I am not fine with is the lack of flow which merges all of these ideas together to make something cohesive and beautiful. And when Square gets it right, they really get it right. But for the most part, 16's presentation is a jarring mess that only caters to stun locking the player's experience, and to be honest with you guys, my stagger meter is very low. If there is one thing that Final Fantasy is known for, its complexity of intertwining narratives and combat systems, bringing about a wonderful experience when it is executed correctly. As not only does this reward the player for their knowledge of the systems at play, it gives new players something to work toward and become exceptional with. When I think back to myself as a child playing Final Fantasy VII on the PS1 with a couple of friends, I kept thinking that this would have been much better if there wasn't turn-based combat. Obviously, I was wrong about that, as people tend to love that style of combat, but for me, I always thought the world design was interesting, but for the gameplay itself, it just didn't click with me. Which is why, when I heard that the lead combat designer for Devil May Cry was going to be working with the Final Fantasy team, I couldn't help but be a little excited. What's strange is that this was a deliberate change by Yoshi P, who felt that the franchise needed an update to its combat system.
On top of that, you have a generation of new gamers who were raised on first-person shooters and games like Grand Theft Auto, where input is always direct. For those players, the thought of having to wait before you act is kind of a disconnect for that young generation. So with our goal to expand the series and broaden the audience, bring back players but also welcome new players, we realized that we had to evolve the series and change it up from what people expected, end quote.
And while I know some Final Fantasy fans feel like they have been left in the dust, to me this was the right call. The gameplay and the combat is really the star of the show. It's not perfect by any means, as I really do think Square could have tweaked a couple things to make that combat loop a little bit more invigorating, but overall, I think they succeeded. At its core, the combat system is a spammy hack and slash system paired with these icon abilities that give Clive special attacks, which are all on timers or cooldowns. By mixing all of the icons and your general attack, you can create these super fun combos that just pummel enemies to death, and it looks amazing as well. Enemies have a health meter and a stun meter, which needs to be depleted in order to kill them, and depending on which type of enemy is spawned in, they can have a special ability that you need to watch out for so that you don't get taken down. The best part about combat is that it feels fantastic. Clive's moveset isn't super deep, but it's deep enough, and as the game progresses, you are able to unlock a ton of moves and pair them all together, which results in some pretty memorable moments. A quick warning, we are going to be covering some spoilers here, as the combat system is directly tied to the main narrative, so just beware, okay? Alright, here we go. Yeah, we're starting now. We're about to do it. Alright, I've warned you. Clive's main arsenal is a sword, which he can use by pressing the square button, and he also has a dodge mechanic that you can use by pressing R1. Using these together allows you to spam the square button to create a 4-combo slash attack, and if you dodge at the right time, you'll perfect dodge, which allows you to slow down time while being able to quickly sneak in an extra attack on your enemy. If you press square while an enemy attack is inbound, you can parry that attack and stun lock them for a second, allowing you to get in some good shots before they get back to their normal state. On the left-hand right-hand side of your screen, you will notice a potion and Torgal, your dog, control HUD, and as you would guess, this allows you to access certain potions to replenish your health, increase your strength, and take control of your pet ally who can do a little bit of damage here and there. And don't worry, you can pet the dog. Initially, I was worried that combat was going to be way too easy, as learning how to dodge and parry is pretty straightforward. This isn't Elden Ring by any stretch, so being able to predict the timing of incoming attacks is fairly simple, but in the late game, there is definitely a lot more going on, making combat a fair and decent challenge. It also helps that there is a special meter underneath Clive's health bar called the Limit Break Gauge. The way to fill this meter up is to simply perform attacks and use your icon abilities, and once the meter is fully charged, you can press L3 and R3 together and Clive will rage into a fireball where he will have increased speed and damage output while also being able to pull some health back from enemies he is currently attacking. But it's the icon abilities that really take the combat to the next level. At the beginning of the game, Clive is blessed with the Fires of the Phoenix, which allow him to output fire damage. And since this skill is core to Clive's story arc, the skill tree allows him to make his regular attack set a little more powerful and I would say interesting. By holding down square or using a combination of the X button plus square, you can perform heavy attacks while your sword is doused in flames. He can also use a series of special attacks that are paired with the R2 button that use the icon ability to perform some really crazy movesets. Every icon gives Clive a choice of a semi-passive ability, 3 active abilities, and an ultimate ability. For example, the Phoenix icon grants Clive the skills to teleport to the enemy so that he can get in close quickly. The active ability includes things like uppercuts and spinning moves that will knock back a handful of enemies. And the ultimate ability will freeze time and hit every enemy in close proximity while giving Clive some of his health back. Over the course of the game, you will acquire 7 icons that you can mix and match however you please. They all have the choice of 3 attacks and 1 special move per ability, which can all be upgraded with your ability points. There is fire, wind, lightning, earth, light, ice, and death, and for the most part, they can all be useful depending on your situation. Square did a solid job balancing out these skills, as you really have to think about what you want to leave behind in order to bring something else very powerful alongside you. One of my favorite icons, the Earth icon, is great at depleting enemy health, while the Wind icon is great for stunning enemies. But the Fire icon is probably the most balanced skill of them all, which is great for depleting health and stunning enemies, so it really just depends on which situation you're going into. As you can see on screen here, there are tons of awesome movesets you can do by flipping between the various dominant skills that allows for a ton of fun and decent variety in combat. Importantly, you can also unlearn skills at almost any point in time in the menu, meaning if you hate a skill, you can take back all of your ability points and invest it in something else entirely with no penalty, which I think is very cool, a nice touch by Square Enix. But sadly, the combat suffers from extremely poor pacing and bloated mediocre quest lines, just like the majority of things do in this game. What's funny and is a bit ironic here is there are nearly 68 chapters in Final Fantasy XVI, and during your playthrough, it feels like it takes forever to learn new icon skills. But actually, if you take a look at a list of all of the chapters in the game, Square Enix did pace things properly in correlation to acquiring these new abilities. About every 12 to 15 chapters, it seems Clive acquires a new icon. But since there are so many interruptions and cutscenes, that's what's actually taking forever, not the in-game progression. Another issue with the combat is the fact that you cannot switch between icons in the middle of battle. Now, I agree it would be overpowered if you could just pause and switch to whatever icon you want, but to make it fair, I think you could just have whatever one you switch to completely depleted so that you can't abuse it right away. And again, since there are so many cutscenes that force you into moments you can't back out from, there are many times where you end up in a boss fight and you want to switch your playstyle, but you can't because you are not allowed to alter it during combat. You can quit and go to the main menu and hope that when you load back in, you are not engaged in the encounter, but it doesn't always work that way. So sometimes you'll be in a tough boss battle, but are stuck with abilities that don't serve you in the long run. The last issue with combat is while you have 3 slots to fill up with your icons, generally 2 of them are always going to be the same, leaving you with only 1 slot to mess around with. The fact of the matter is, Clive has been blessed with fire, meaning his abilities abilities work best with the fire icon class, and the wind icon, aka Garuda, is the best at putting enemies into a stun lock position since it has the highest stagger damage output. It also has a special grapple that will pull enemies down when their stagger meter is half full, which is super effective during big boss battles. This means there is really only one slot left to play with. And while lightning, ice, light, and the death abilities are super fun to use, particularly the death ability, the earth ability is one of the best to keep on you. This icon will allow you to parry in the traditional sense where you can actually block with a giant fist at the same time as an enemy is striking you and perform an offensive combo counterattack simultaneously. So between enhancing Clive's fire abilities, having extra stun damage, and an extra parry ability on you at all times, there is really no reason to run anything else. And while I do think there is a give and take between classes and it's pretty substantial, there is most certainly a meta to this game, and I believe that it is Earth, Wind, and Fire. And since those abilities are the ones you gather up early on in the game, you generally spend a majority of your time using what are the best setups, which can lead to a universally more plain experience. Final Fantasy XVI was clearly never designed to be a fully open world experience, but it is clear that it was curated with some exploration in mind. There are in fact hidden items, chests, and side quests to complete. Again, this would be akin to the God of War's, Jedi Survivors, or one of the many games that have come out in recent memory that has light open world exploration. All that to say, the open world and level design in 16, however small it may be, has to be some of the most amateur work I have ever seen in a AAA video game. Now, this is not to be confused with the art design of the levels, because that is top tier and, dare I say, some of the best eye candy I have ever seen in a AAA video game, but the structure that is housing this semi-open world is quite frankly laughable. Every single area that you travel in has a central hub with a line sticking out of it, and you land in the town square, run down the road, turn around, and that's the end of it. There is no depth, there is no interconnectivity, there is no exploration, there is no reward for learning the area you are in, there is no reason to care. Now, my brain stems off into two different paths when thinking about exploration, not too dissimilar from this game. The first idea I have is that this feels really unrewarding. During God of War Ragnarok, I will never forget making my way to one of the main boss encounters, and along this journey, I stumbled into a weird little corner of the map that had a really tough mini-boss stationed there. And while initially I couldn't beat the boss, I eventually leveled up and went back and destroyed it. It felt very rewarding. I found this boss on my own, I beat it on my own, and while the experience wasn't unique in the sense that I was the only person in the world who ever fought it, it was unique in the way of how I discovered it. And this feeling is barely present in Final Fantasy XVI. The ideas of discovery are essentially non-existent. There is no alternate paths to take, there is no secret boss to discover, and there aren't any rewards for that exploration. There was only one instance where I found anything exciting in Final Fantasy. It was towards the end of the game, and I turned right instead of left at this crossroads, and I found a bracelet that gave me 500 extra health points. But it was just sitting there. Anyone could have found it. It wasn't hidden. There wasn't a sense of magic when I discovered it. It was just kind of sitting there, and I bet most of you watching found the same exact item. This experience is no different than going to Universal Studios and getting on the Jaws ride. And there's nothing wrong with that. It just feels a little bit claustrophobic at times. Alright, so that's my first thought. Now let me explain my second one. So part of me is completely fine with this experience, and in fact, I'm kind of glad that 16 doesn't have a ton to explore and collect, because quite frankly, I'm sick of doing this every few months with every new video game. I kind of just like hopping inside of the world and experiencing what the devs want me to experience, and that I don't need to explore every nook and cranny of the game to get some rare loot or gem. I can simply kill some bad guys, enjoy the story, and that's completely fine. However, the difference when compared to something like the other games I have mentioned in this review is that even though those games are on rails as well, they don't always feel like they are. Resident Evil 4 Remake made great use of the space by having you backtrack and explore new areas, unlock new or hidden spaces with new abilities, and use video game trickery to often hide the fact that the game is on a singular path by somehow making things seem bigger than they really are. I just wish 16 would have tried tried to implement more rewards by having the player garner new abilities to explore uncharted areas that were previously closed off, and by doing this, maybe we could get a secret sword or gauntlet or something along those lines. And while it's nice to not have to worry about grinding for rare loot, it seems like this would have been a great game for those systems, as the RPG mechanics as they are suffer from the lack of it. Speaking of RPG mechanics, I would have to say that they are just okay. And again, just like the combat, they're not super complex. Yes, you can upgrade your icon abilities in the menu, and you can also tab over to see slots for your weapon, wearables, and your amulets. And man, I wish these systems went deeper because, again, there is a ton of potential here. If you take a look at my character, you can see that each piece of my gear helps with some offensive or defensive characteristic, and the amulets will help with cooldowns or buffs for your icon abilities. Pretty cool, pretty straightforward. But why not do more? Why not make epic amulets that apply more than one mod to your icon? Why not have a legendary sword that can buff your defensive skills as well? Or even an uber epic piece of gear that buffs all stats by 50 points? It's not really the amount of slots that's important, but how many abilities are packed into each item that you're wearing. And to be honest, I still don't think that's enough. If we hop over to the abilities tab, the main ring in the center houses all the skills for the magic combat. I just think it would have been awesome for more skills towards Clive's non-magic body, maybe increased sprint speed or higher jumping, a faster dodge mechanic, just anything. And something else I don't quite understand is the need for an item rarity system. Just take a look at these blades right here. Why is there any difference between them? The only metrics are damage and stagger. I have a common sword that is both better than a rare and a legendary. Why even rank them accordingly if there is no elemental damage or debuff for enemies? The effectiveness of each item could have been implemented so much better, and it bums me out because I know how good it could have been. There is also a crafting system and an in-game economy in 16 as well, and while occasionally you will earn a basic weapon from a boss or get an item as part of the campaign, it's nice to be able to upgrade some of your more basic weapons whenever you have the materials to do so. I wish you just could have added extra magic abilities in crafting. For example, maybe you find a frost amulet in your travels and you can melt it down into a coating for your sword, and every 12th hit, a frost blast emits from your sword in tandem with your fire and other iconic abilities. Again, I know this isn't what we got, but I just think it could have been so much more. I know, I'm a broken record. While the combat is clearly the highlight for this game, the combat couldn't exist if there weren't great enemies to take down. And fortunately, Square Enix knocked it out of the park with this one. Not only are the boss fights fun and engaging, but they are executed very well from a difficulty and narrative standpoint as you gradually build up to stronger and more epic foes. As you can tell by now, the pacing of the narrative really pulled me out from enjoying this game fully, and I will say it once more, but if the cutscene and quest bloat was cut down, the gradual incline from boss to boss would have flowed seamlessly. Now, as you can see on screen, there are some great and amazing boss battles that are just as good as anything you would find in the AAA video game landscape. The moves are telegraphed very nicely, the systems are clear and easily understood, and something I really like is most bosses will have 2 to 4 phases with special movesets that serve as checkpoints throughout the fight. Initially, I was not a fan of these checkpoints, however, they work in succession with your health system, and there aren't as many health potions lying around until the later game, so you don't really get to replenish your health unless you buy them. So dying mid-boss fight will always allow you to restock on health and save the initial amount of damage that you have done to the boss. At first, the system is pretty broken and overpowered, but eventually it balances out and makes a ton more sense when you see how the boss fights are designed in the last half of the game. So let's talk about that. What happens halfway through the game? Well, Square has done something quite remarkable with boss fights, and it's something I wasn't expecting at all, and I am damn glad that they used their power of over-engineering here because it worked out big time. These boss fights that you will experience are some of the best I have ever played through in my entire life. They are cinematic, challenging, fun, artistic, ridiculously over the top. They're just perfect. As I have mentioned previously, Clive earns his abilities from garnering another's iconic power after their defeat, and throughout 16, we are taking dominance in their vessels down, harnessing their power and becoming more badass. And while the first boss encounter against Garuda and Benedicta is one for the books, the boss fights only become better, and that starts with Hugo, aka the Titan. The fight against Hugo is absolutely insane. We start off by fighting him in his normal state, then continue through multiple evolutions and phases of the fight. Everything is turned up to 11 and you won't want to miss a second of it. There is a mix between regular combat, iconic abilities, dominant abilities, quick time events, set changes, and cutscenes. I genuinely have never experienced anything so phenomenal before. And this is why I'm having such a hard time with this review, because I did love part of this game quite a bit. It's really everything surrounding these magnificent aspects of this game that ruined my experience. Aside from the regular bosses that you encounter through the story, the enemy variety is very good as well. There are clear tiers of enemies to distinguish from, and they're generally all fun to fight. There are also a ton of low tier and mid tier bosses you will be fighting along the way that could be considered their own fully fledged boss encounters. It's truly a magical experience, and if you are struggling to get through this game like I did, these are the moments worth waiting for. I want to praise the devs for launching with New Game Plus, as it is imperative for a single player experience with these types of gameplay mechanics. I think Final Fantasy will really shine during NGP, and I wanted to see if some of my concerns would be alleviated by trying the game again, so I have started playing through the beginning portion. Having all of your weapons and abilities makes combat so much more fun right from the get-go. Enemies and bosses are harder with more health, and you can skip every single cutscene, which keeps you in the gameplay with limited interruptions. And to my surprise, it looks like the in-game economy starts to pick up here as well. I was getting more rare items, and there is a special weapon in my inventory waiting to be crafted, and I won't spoil it for you, but it does look pretty damn cool. The last thing I wanted to talk about was the art design and the performance of it on the PS5. It's clear that Square Enix has implemented some of the best and most fantastic artistic design when it comes to Final Fantasy XVI. Every level, every boss, every enemy, every character is just beaming with style and polished to perfection. And getting all of this to run smoothly on the PS5 with enough particle effects to deplete a small country of all of its resources is a marvel of engineering. I know people are complaining that this game should be running at 60 FPS, and perhaps it should be, but I have been playing it on quality mode and getting a Blue Chew rock solid 30 FPS, and the game plays perfectly on it as well. Performance mode, on the other hand, does fairly well in combat, but it drops the resolution down to around 720p with upscaling and uses so much motion blur, it was actually making me nauseous, which is something that is not common for me. The lack of accessibility settings is also frustrating, but putting quality mode on removed any issues I was having with frame rate or motion blur, and the experience was exceptional. I really want to make things clear here. Final Fantasy XVI is not a bad game. It wasn't broken at launch like Jedi Survivor, it wasn't an incomplete mess like Redfall, and it didn't need an extra year in the oven like Halo Infinite. Square Enix stuck to their guns and made the game that they wanted to make, and I applaud them for it. At its core, 16 is a fantastic game, but you have to wade through a lot of bullshit to actually experience it. And what's even more frustrating is if you did remove all of that mediocrity and bloat from this package, the core game itself would be boring, as the systemic infrastructure propping it up wouldn't be deep enough. It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation here. If the developers would have just cut excess cutscenes, terrible main quest lines, and spent that energy on making the combat and RPG mechanics deeper and the open worlds richer with content, this game would have no doubt been a must-play for everyone. The story is interesting, the characters are lovable, the passion in which they promote family and loyalty to the ones they love, it's all amazing. But Square just didn't know when to stop themselves. And if there's one thing I have learned in my life, it's that not every idea is a good idea, and you need to know your own boundaries. One of the things that I have praised about games like God of War Ragnarok, Jedi Survivor, and even the Resident Evil 4 remake was how these games had taken all of the things that made the narrative-driven action-adventure great. They boiled these things down together in a way that allowed for constant enjoyment by never breaking player engagement. I understand that Square Enix was not trying to make a one-to-one replica of any one of these AAA games, but after hearing the director of the franchise saying that it was his goal to modernize Final Fantasy for a newer audience, it seems a little hypocritical and disrespectful to the player's time with all the other ways the game does in fact waste it. It brings me no joy to critique the game in this way. Like I said, I was really looking forward to this title, and I know how hard the developers worked on it, and tearing apart other people's work isn't something that I like to do. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.